So today's lesson this afternoon, we're going to cover Angular's $HTTP, and it's pretty much the Angular-esque way to make AJAX calls using Angular. So what you guys did on Monday and Tuesday, we wanted to get you guys some practice in using kind of the jQuery-esque way to ping, third-party APIs and such. So now we're going to see how we can do that in the Angular environment. So far, we've only been working with hard-coded data. So we just hard-coded some data inside of our controllers. But today we're going to kick it up a notch. So we're going to learn a little about two different functionalities in Angular that will allow us to start communicating with real data accessed through an API. So what we're going to be doing today is very similar to what you guys did Monday and Tuesday. We're just going to see the Angular way to do it. So you'll need to dust off your knowledge of RESTful routes and AJAX, but hopefully that's a good thing. Now, since we're going to be interacting with an API, in an ideal world, would force you to write one first, and you will have to write one for your project 3. So you'll totally be able to do that. But today, in the interest of time, so we can skip to the good stuff, we're going to use a pre-built backend for this lesson. And so that's what I'm going to give you to work on. I'll also give you a pre-built backend to work on your lab as well. So we want to make it fast. We've already made you a sweet little Express and Node API. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to walk you through what this looks like, and then I'll give you guys an opportunity to grab the code from your Student Labs folder and get set up. But let me just walk through what we're dealing with here. I'm going to share my screen. So for this one, I made a copy of the code that's in your Student Labs folder. I put it into today's instructor examples folder. So that's the one that I'm going to be working on. And what this looks like, let me go ahead and open it up in Atom. So we're all going to be starting from the same starter code. And I'm going to walk through what all these various folders and such mean, because this is going to be a little bit more complex than what you guys did for homework and the code that we worked on yesterday. Let me go ahead and npm install. Make sure I'm in the right, yeah. So npm install. So for this app, we have several different packages that we're going to be using. All these are given for you, so you don't have to worry about that. We're only going to be mainly working on like 2 files today. But I want to point out, so when you open up the starter code, you're going to have a public folder, just like we worked on yesterday and this morning. The public folder is going to be, you can consider that the front end of your application. So the public folder is going to have your index.html. It'll have all of your Angular code in the JavaScript file, and then have some very simple style.css stuff. All these other folders you can consider backend. So you can essentially consider this a mean stack app or a min stack app, and the Angular part, is all in that public folder. So anything that's not in the public folder is the backend component of this application. We have a models folder. I'm going to actually, I charted out kind of the workflow of this app, and I'll show you guys that after you get everything set up. But we have a controllers folder here, and this is the Express router. So this is the backend controller. So just want to, because sometimes that's a little confusing. So we're going to have an Express router controller, and we're also going to have an Angular controller. So 2 different types of controllers that we're talking about. And then we'll have some routes and some seeds in this config folder. So to get started, I gave you guys a seeds file just so we have some code to work with, some data to work with rather. So let me load that up. So you guys are going to run node config seeds.js. So this is a president's application. So I wanted to give you guys 4 presidents to start with. I'm going to encourage you guys to have 3 or 4 tabs open. So for this app, I'm going to help walk you guys through all this to get set up. But just keep in mind that you're going to have your NodeMon server running. You're also going to need to have MonGod running because we're going to use the Mongo database. And then you probably want to keep another tab open so you can do the command line instructions and such. That's just how I like to run things. So let me run my nodemon server.js. And this is going to be running on port 3000. So this is what the front end of the app is going to look like. This is the Angular front end, okay? This is the client side. But what I want to point out is that there's also an API Express node component that's serving the data to our Angular front end. And the way that we can see that is still going to be running on localhost. But if we go to precedence, here's all the JSON data coming from our database. So Node and Express, there's two separate processes working here. So Node and Express is serving up some JSON data from our database, and Angular is consuming that data and rendering the view. So even though I combined all of this into one application, there's still like a back-end and a front-end component to this app. And so this is sometimes kind of a tricky thing to wrap your mind around. I'm going to walk through how all this connects together. But this would be considered like the server-side API, just like you guys did on Monday and Tuesday, serving up all of the data. And then this is considered our front end. This is the index.html, and it's grabbing that data, George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, etc. And so we're going to build some code to be able to create a new president, to delete a president, and then tomorrow you guys are going to walk through updating and showing a president. So I just want to get to this point, make sure that we're all set up and such. So we'll put a pin in it right there. And let me put in the instructions. And we'll just take a few minutes. I want to make sure that you guys are up and running and error-free. So go ahead and do a git pull upstream master, and then go into your student labs folder. And the name of the app should be President's App Starter Code Single App Version. Like I said, initially, this was actually two separate apps, the back end and the front end, and I combined it into one app to hopefully make it a little easier to manage. And so once you CD into that folder, go ahead and npm install. And if you want to open up the project in Atom, and then you can run the app with nodemon server.js. And then just to test it out, if you go to localhost 3000, that should be your front end Angular. And just to test out kind of the JSON API component, we're serving all of that data up on /presidents. So if you just want to test that out, after you run that node config /seeds. So you need to seed your database with some presidents, so we'll have something to play around with. And give me a thumbs up when you get that up and running. And if you're having any issues or anything, just let me know. Just want to make sure we're all good to go before we move forward.
I'm getting a throw error with the seeds, node config seeds.
Okay. All right, let me stop my screen share. You can share your screen. Okay, go for it.
So node config seeds, right? Oh, I see the mistake. I see a mistake.
Go ahead and submit a bug issue for that, Kieran, if you don't mind. That'd be great. Yes. All right. So we got 5 thumbs ups. Okay. Just waiting on one more thumbs up, and we'll move forward. Terminal says Mongoose connection disconnected, but it all works and looks like Mongoose is connected. Yeah, that's fine. So in the seeds file, I put in some code that will close the connection after you after it sees the database. It's a good practice to close the database. So I console log that message. I think you should be fine. Did you get that message when you ran the seeds file? Okay. Yeah, just give me a heads up if you have any issues, going forward. Cool. All right. So what I wanted to do quickly, I was all excited this morning because I wanted to bring out the little digital whiteboard, and I was going to walk through the nuts and bolts of this app. And so I started working on doing this on the little digital whiteboard, and I saved it, but then I couldn't go back and write over it. I'm still not quite sure how the little whiteboard thing works, and I'm not a very good drawer anyway. So this is as far as I got. And so I want to use this as an example. I want to try to walk through how this app works, because there's a lot going on here, and there's different files. There's 2 controllers. So I just want to try to walk through this at the top and just give you guys some clarity on kind of the flow of this application. So that's what this awesome looking PNG is doing here. So let's walk through it. If you look at that PNG, if you open it up, so this is the President's app starter code Angular $HTTP lesson for reference. And this is kind of the data flow, how this thing works. On the left-hand side of that vertical red line, this is everything front end. This is an Angular front end. We also call it the client side. And it's everything in the public folder. So when you look in Atom, if you look at this app, everything in the public folder is the client side. It's everything that the browser has access to. And everything on the left of that vertical line, that's all the Node Express Mongo backend stuff. And that's the server side. So in the context of Atom in this application, the only folder that is Angular front end code is the public folder. Everything else you see is Node and Express related. Like I said, initially this app was actually 2 separate apps. We had a Node and Express app just to serve the data, and then an Angular app just to consume that data. But I wanted to combine it into one because this is kind of the structure of what your project 3 is going to look like. So I wanted to give you guys, a good model of that. So we start at the left-hand side of that diagram. So we have in the public index.html. So that's what we're seeing. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll walk through this and answer any questions you guys have. So we have our front end, our index.html. That's what's rendering in the browser here. And so we're getting this data from the Angular President's controller. And that's in the public JS President's controller file. So that's right here. So this is the Angular controller, the front end controller. And I have it, I'm going to keep all the front end stuff at the bottom of my Atom. So this is the Angular module. This is front end. So this is the President's controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to build this out so that we're making $HTTP calls to the Node and Express section. of our application. So what we'll do is we're going to write some code in here that's then going to ping our Node and Express Mongo area for all the data. So if you follow the arrow in that awesome looking diagram I made, we're going to write, the first thing we're going to do is write a $http.get request. And that the first thing that's going to hit is our config routes.js file. So if you go into config and then routes.js, so this is the first thing that it's going to hit. This is our Express router. So it's going to come in here, and this is set up a little differently than how you may have seen in the past. This is a little bit more concise. So this is kind of a cool pattern. We have router.route. So what we do is anytime we get something from /presidents, we then chain on, the various requests that path can accept. So /presidents has a get request that it can accept. It also has a post request. Down here, we have router.route. So here are different HTTP requests to presidents /:ID. So these are things like a show page. So get me the specific president. This would also be if we wanted to update a president, it would also be hitting this route. And also if we wanted to delete a president, it would hit this route as well. So one thing I would point out, if you look at these routes in total, there's only 5 routes. And that's because we don't have a new or an edit route. Our Node and Express app is not rendering any views because Angular is doing that for us on the front end. So the only routes we need to create on the Node and Express side are all the routes that pertain to data. So that's going to be our index route with a get, our post route or our create route, our get route for a show to get one president, update one president, and then delete one president. But I just wanted you guys to see this pattern because this is just one way to set up an app. But this just chains together the HTTP calls using dot notation onto this route. It's just a little bit more of a concise way to write your routes. Okay, so after it hits our routes, it's then going to go to controllers /presidents. So this is the Express Mongoose controller. So for example, if we want to get all the presidents, we're going to send a request to /presidents. We're going to send a get request specifically. And then that's going to hit our president's controller gets all method. I'm also requiring that president's controller file right here. So then we'll go to a president's controller, which is in our controllers file, and it's called presidents.js. You could call this president's controller if you wanted. You're just trying to, I could have called this president's controller like Express or whatever, but just remember that we have 2 different controllers that we're dealing with. This is the server-side controller. So inside of the president's controller, here's all the Mongoose queries. So this should be familiar from project 2. So to get all the presidents, we're going to hit this function right here, this get all. And so this should hopefully be somewhat familiar from project 2. So here's our president.find, which will grab all the presidents. And then it's going to send the presidents back as JSON right here. So remember that Node and Express, we're not using response.render because Angular is handling all of that rendering. The only thing Angular needs are the ingredients, all the data. And so that's why I was showing you guys here in the browser. So this is the front end. This is index.html. And then this is what Node and Express is going to send us. So when we go to /presidents, Angular is going to grab this data, and then it's going to bake that into the view that we see here. So this is Angular front end. This is the Node Express backend. This is what it's sending us. So 2 very cool things are happening. We have a backend and then a pretty robust Angular front end that we're working with. So I just wanted to try to kind of walk through that initially because I know that this setup can be a little confusing the first time you see it. But again, this will be pretty similar to how you'll want to build your project 3 in broad strokes. So any questions about how this app is working before we start building anything?
Yeah, I feel like I if you can please just kind of repeat that part about the president's database in the back end controller. I feel like I heard you say it
Yeah.
once or twice, but I just wasn't connecting it in my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I wish my my whiteboard hadn't crapped out, or I would draw on it even more. Yeah, so let's do it in reverse, actually. So we'll try from the back end to the front end. So in this president's controller, so this is back end code. This should look familiar to you guys. This is all of the functions, all of the Mongoose queries. So president.find, the only model we're dealing with are presidents today. A president.find is a Mongoose query, right? So that should be familiar. So we're going to query our database, give me all of the presidents, and then wrap it in JSON and send it as a JSON object. So remember with Angular, Angular is going to manage all of our views. The only thing that Angular needs is data. That's all that it needs. All that Angular needs is a JSON object with data that it can like bake into a view. So this is coming from our database. This is server side. This is localhost 3000 / presidents. This is all coming from our Mongo database. So we have this get all function, and this is in the president's controller on the server side. And then if we go to our routes, again, this is the express router. We go up here, we have express, we have router. So anytime express gets a get request to / presidents, it's going to go into the president's controller that we just looked at and call the get all function. So that's what we just walked through right here. Here's the get all function, and this is the president's controller. So what this function does is it's going to render something that looks like this. It's going to grab some JSON and send it back to our front end. But this is how these two things go together. You could probably cram all this stuff into one file, but again, it's going to be best practice, particularly as you guys get into your projects with more complex models and authentication. It's going to be best to parse this stuff out in separate files. But this function pings the database, and this router is what grabs that data, and then it's going to send it back to the Angular front end. And then on the Angular side, if we go to the public folder, so remember the public folder is all of the client-side code, all of the Angular code. And we go to the president's controller. I'm going to move that down here. So everything down here is front-end code. So this is the Angular president's controller. So this is what grabs all of this JSON data and bakes it into a web page. So we can see the Angular.module. We have this president's controller. We're going to reconfigure this. Right now, we're not actually hitting the database. We've hard-coded the data, but it's going to look the same once we convert it. But the president's controller, we're going to make a $HTTP. That's the whole point of today. We're going to make an AJAX request that's actually going to grab this from our server. This is pretty much the same data. But instead of hard-coding this array, what we're going to be doing is making an AJAX request to the Express server to get that same data set. And then once the Angular controller receives that data, then our index.html, so this should look familiar. We have our ng app directive, the president's app, so that's the name of our Angular module. We just have one ng controller that we're playing with today. So we have the president's controller as presidents, and then we're going to repeat each president in presidents.all. So essentially, we're just going to loop over this president's array of 4 president objects. So we have George Washington, John Adams, etc. And then we're just going to print it out to the screen. Angular is going to do that for us. And this is what it's going to look like initially. So again, this is Angular taking this raw JSON and baking a view out of it. And so that's the process of what we're going to be kind of walking through today. Is that a little more helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, no joke, there's a lot of moving parts in here, so it can definitely be a little confusing at first. Okay, but we're all up and running, so that's good. So let's move forward. So let's do our first HTTP call. Yeah, and you'll also have the video available. The lab I'm going to give you this afternoon is pretty much going through the same process, but with a different model. Today we're dealing with presidents. This afternoon you'll deal with criminals. Although now that I think about it, usually that's one and the same, but we won't get political here. But you're going to build another version of this afternoon. So hitting an API with $HTTP. So you can think about $HTTP. It's just the Angular way to make AJAX calls, the way that you did on Monday and Tuesday. But we're going to see the fancy pants way that Angular does it. So the simplest starting point will be to switch our hard-coded array of presidents with the array of presidents living in our new API. So if you guys go to your public folder, JavaScript folder, the presidents controller, the Angular controller, I already deleted it. But notice that we have this hard-coded array of presidents. So this is actually what's currently being served up in our Angular front end. We're going to switch it so that we're actually hitting our database in the back end. But technically speaking, we're grabbing the hard-coded data from here. So I could change this to Schmitty, my favorite. And if I refresh, what did I break? There we go, just needed to reload. There I have Schmitty right here. But the Node and Express, the database still has George Washington. So right now although we seeded our database, we're still like technically hitting this hard-coded garbage. But we're gonna switch it out so we're actually getting the correct data from the actual database. So what we wanna do is, first of all, let's go ahead and just rip out that hard-coded president's data. And you can just make it an empty array, that'll be fine. So once we get rid of that hard-coded data, if we refresh our front end, notice that all of our presidents go away. So just to demonstrate that we were dealing with the hard-coded array of presidents. However, we seeded our database. So our Node and Express database still has those 4 seeded presidents, and it's just ready for us to grab that, grab that information so Angular can take advantage of it. So that's what we're going to build. We're going to build that bridge. So go ahead and make that an empty array for now. And we talked about dependency injection with Angular. And so to take advantage of $HTTP, we're going to need to inject $HTTP as a dependency. Technically, $HTTP is an example of an Angular service. So an Angular service is another type of module that has kind of like a third-party library, if you will. But it's a way that we can inject functionality into Angular on a case-by-case basis. So if we had all of the functionality in Angular out of the box, that would be a huge library. But Angular has this dependency injection, so as we need certain features, we can grab the modules for those features and inject them into our application. So what we're going to use is the $HTTP service or module. It's kind of the same, one and the same. So the first thing we need to do is we want to call the .inject method, $inject method. So if you go into your president's controller, let's do a president's controller, $inject. So this is an Angular method. And then let's make that equal to $HTTP. So it's really important, that needs to be a string, that $HTTP. So again, if you go to different blogs, tutorials, you'll see this set up in a different way. This is, in my opinion, like the best practice to do it. The reason that we're using this $inject is because sometimes when we minify, when we push our code to production, there's a minification process involved. So if you remember, minification is when we strip out like the white space all the extra stuff from our code. Because remember, we write code so humans can read it. But during minification, the minification compiler will strip out all the white space, variable names. It'll take a variable called president's controller, and it'll just make that variable A. It'll make something else variable B. In minified code, a computer knows how to make sense of that, but we as humans cannot. Occasionally, in minification of Angular code, those variables can get mixed up in minification, and sometimes the global namespace gets polluted. So if a computer makes a variable A, and you just happen to have a variable A that you like hard-coded in your app, the computer doesn't know if this is the variable A that you intended, or if it's the dummy variable A that it created to make your file smaller. So there's certain complications that can occasionally happen with minification. One way to avoid that is to use this $inject. So this is just a way to safely inject modules into Angular and make sure that the minification issues don't happen. And this is kind of the preferred way to do it, in my opinion, and a lot of great kind of leading thought makers on Angular, this is how they suggest that we set up our app. Anywho, so we want to do the $inject, $HTTP, and then the next thing we want to do is pass it in as an argument into our controller, like so. So two things we need to do. It's called $inject, and then pass it in. And then we also need to literally pass it into the controller. So two steps there. Alrighty. So now that we have access to our $HTTP module, let's actually create a get precedence function that we can put this HTTP code into. So this would be a good way to modularize it. But we're going to do a couple of other configurations to our code. So remember that functions have local scope. And so the first thing we want to do, taking a look at that screenshot, let's go ahead and set up a var self equals this. So this is going to be a way to set up the global scope of our president's controller to keep it separate from the local scope of each function that we create. Because remember, every function has a this. So we want to make sure that we separate the global this of our controller versus each function that we create. So that'll be the first step. And then we can change this to self.all. We can change that to self, because all of these are like the president's controller methods and properties. So that'll work for now. Eventually, we'll update this add president feature later. Cool, so now that we've figured out kind of the self equals this, let us just make a few spaces. And let's go ahead and instantiate that get precedence function. So go ahead and create a get precedence. And in here, we're going to actually write the code, the Ajax code, like you guys did on Monday and Tuesday, to go and grab this stuff from our server. So inside the get precedence function, we'll start off with $HTTP. And if you look at the screenshot, this is similar to using promises or using jQuery. It's really however you want to do this. If you want to put each chained method on new lines, that's fine for readability. It's up to you. But since we're going to do a GET request, we're going to do $HTTP.get. And the path that we want to hit is precedence. So we're going to make a GET request to /precedence. And I know that because if I go back to my Express node code, here's how I have my route set up. So when Express detects a request to /precedence, specifically a .get, it's going to hit that get all function. So That's how this is set up. You can also see that here in the localhost. So localhost /presidents, I know that that is going to, I need to turn off all my replies. I'm sorry. Jeez. If I go to local, geez, I got to turn that off. If I go to localhost 3000 /presidents, I can see all my data. So I know that I need to hit this /presidents. I don't need to put the localhost 3000 because I'm already serving my Angular front end on localhost 3000. So I don't need to put that. I can just deal with the /presidents. So that'll start our $HTTP get. So once I hit that route, that's going to return some code that requires a promise. So we're going to chain a .then. And remember that our .then takes a callback response. And then inside the response, what we want to do, so this self.all initially was the array of all of our presidents. So let's set this self.all to the array of this presidents coming from the database. It's going to be tomato, tomato. So this array of presidents is going to be returned in this response object. So down here inside of our then promise, let's do a self.all, and we'll make that equal to response.data presidents, like so. And I can already see what that data looks like over here, right? So I'm going to get back a response object with the president's key and the value of that array. So that's why I know I need to do response.data.presidents. And we'll close that up. And I think I've got all my indentation correct. It looks pretty good. Cool. And then the last step, it's in this next screenshot that I'll put into Slack. The next step is that we just need to call that method, call that function rather. Let's just go ahead and call it whenever this controller is instantiated. So whenever we load the page, let's just go ahead and call get presidents, like so. So whenever the page loads, it's going to read the president's controller code, and then it's going to call the get presidents function. And it'll go ahead and make a request to grab all that data. Now, for the really exciting part, when we refresh our browser, we did delete all the presidents. So now when we refresh, we should see our 4 presidents back again. So let's make sure that this is working. So we refresh and ta-da. So now we're grabbing those 4 presidents, but we're grabbing the 4 presidents from our database using a $HTTP call, .get method to be precise. So that's pretty cool. So it looks the same as when we started, but we went from hard-coded presidents to now we're actually pinging the database. So that's pretty exciting stuff. So let's put a pin in it right there. I want to make sure that we're all up to speed. So give me a thumbs up if your $HTTP get is working, meaning that it's returning those 4 awesome presidents. There we go. And if anyone's having, if anything's blowing up, let me know, and we'll get you sorted out. I'll stop my screen share for the moment. And the other thing you can do if you want, let me put the other kind of description from the lesson into Slack. But if you want to see what that response object looks like, you can also console log the response in the Angular controller. specifically inside that .then. So remember that now that we're dealing, Angular is all front-end code. So whenever we put a console log into our Angular controller, it's going to console in the browser because we're dealing with client-side front-end code. And my screenshot's taking a minute. Well, let me just share my screen. I don't know why that's taking so long. I'm sure. Did you guys miss me? Just went off there for a second. Let me see if that screenshot will work again. There we go. There we go. So let me share my screen, try this again. And I just want to show you guys how you can console log it and just check out that response object. So right down here in my president's controller, for example, if I wanted to see that response object, I can just console log the response inside of the promise, the .then. And so this response, again, it should pretty much look like that array of presidents. More specifically, let me do .data. And so if I refresh the page, let me open up my console. So if I refresh the browser, so here's the response object. So it's an object, it's an array of 4 presidents. So when I open up those objects, there's all my presidents right there. So remember, this is what Angular is receiving from the server side. And if you want, we can actually console log the server side code, how it's getting that from the database. And the way that we could do that is if you want to go into, let's go into presidents.js. So go into the controller's presidents.js file. So remember that this controller is the kind of the Mongoose query controller. And so if we want to see what it looks like on the server side, we could put a console log inside of the .find, kind of inside this callback. So once we hit the Mongo database with the .find, let's console log presidents. So let's console log what's returned. And so this console log is going to be in the terminal because this is server side. So we'll console log presidents right there, right before we send it back as a JSON object. So let's watch the server right here, and we'll see that presidents object show itself. So if I refresh the page, and there we go. So on the server side, this is coming directly from the Mongo database, and it's getting sent via localhost 3000/presidents back to Angular. And then Angular, open up my console again, Angular receives that as the response object right here. And there's all of our good stuff. And I'll stop my screen share for the moment. So everyone was talking about me while I was gone. That must have been pretty quick. That was pretty instantaneous. So how many thumbs ups do we have? So did everyone get that http.get working? Is anyone blowing up? Okay, cool. That's awesome.
Not getting it working. I'm not sure if I may have put it in the wrong space in the function because I'm still confused about that a little bit, but I think you're okay. Right.
Yeah, so I think what we'll do is this. So we have like 8 minutes to lunch. So I have kind of an exercise for you guys before we move into lab this afternoon. So let's go ahead and break for lunch. And Audrey, I'm happy to help you out, but we don't really have time to hop into kind of the exercise portion. So we'll do that when we get back. So we'll just break for lunch a little bit early. So we'll come back at 2:30. I want you guys to flesh this out, add like a delete route to this, and add the create route. So I want you guys to be able to create a new president using that form. So we'll finish up this app, and then I have another app very similar to add new criminals. The same structure. So give you guys some more practice. So I'll stick around until 1:30 to help out with anything. Otherwise, go ahead and break for lunch. We'll see you guys at 2:30, and we will proceed. And then Audrey, go ahead and share your screen if you want. I think you're on mute. I'm not sure if you're trying to talk or not, but.